Hello and welcome to the program. Ukraine's Cabinet of Ministers has introduced the draft law on the state budget of Ukraine for 2020 to the Verkhovna Rada. The government plans to raise about $15.4 billion in borrowings next year. Meanwhile, the National Bank of Ukraine and the International Monetary Fund have begun joint work on a new program of cooperation. Joining us in our studio to expand on this topic is Mariya Repko. She's a Deputy Executive Director at the Center for Economic Strategy. Hello, and thank you for coming today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So first we're gonna go for a little bit of an overview for the budget on the budget a bit later. But first, would you call this compared to last year's budget? Would you call this budget balanced?
Yeah, well, because the budget deficit is smaller than it was in the previous year. We had the budget balance at 2.25% of GDP, and now this year, I mean in 2020, we will have the deficit of 2.09% of GDP, so that's a small but improvement.
Now, and would you call it realistic, this kind of, there's a draft of the budget?
The macroeconomic forecasts are more or less close to reality, because the GDP forecast of 3.3% GDP growth and the inflation of 6%, they are pretty close to the targets which government, like the previous government, set up for themselves, and the new government, they even want to beat these forecasts, so I would say this is a pretty good estimation.
Now, what would be, and to delve into a little bit, not the details, but the overview of this budget, what would be the major changes between this year's draft budget, because it's still a draft budget,
yeah,
it has to be voted first, and 2019?
The thing is that it could be amended even before it would be voted. Many changes can come, and for example, there are many talks on exchange rate, which was forecasted back in May 2019, and of course, with the hryvnia revaluation, this forecast must be changed. Now it is irrelevant to the current situation, even for 2019. So for 2020, it might be just completely another figure. What else can be changed? The GDP forecast actually also can be changed, because the new government is eager to see the better and faster economic growth. Also, some reforms might be incorporated, like the agricultural reform, privatization, and so on and so forth. So we expect to see many changes in this budget draft before the voting.
Now, you talked about the agricultural reform. That's one of the key landmarks reform of Mr. Zelensky. And he also has this, let's say, called liberal economy, calling for investors, calling for international investors to come to Ukraine, opening the market. How does that kind of decision of policy influence the draft of the budget?
The land reform will definitely bring more incomes if we will have a free land market, so economy will fasten its growth, and of course there will be more tax incomes and so on and so forth. But about the investments, I would say I'm not so optimistic as Mr. Zelensky and his Prime Minister are, because investors need the very basic change of the rules of the game. So they need the protection of property rights, protection of contracts, and contract enforcement, and so on and so forth. And this demands the court reform and justice reform, which is a far more complicated thing than some deregulation which was already done.
Now, which brings me to my next question: because Mr. Zelensky does have a big support for the population, and also he won with the landslide the presidential election. His party is now does have the parliament. It's now the most powerful in the parliament. What real power does have the executive and legislative power when it comes to these reform, when it comes to economy and economic changes here?
You know, we come closer to the question of political will, and here I still feel a little bit uncertain. because we have so many bright and actually positive signals from Mr. Zelensky team, like appointing the technocratic government and well-known ministers for their liberal economic principles and so on. So many really respected people came to the power. But on the other hand, we still have some strange decisions by the courts and some not really perfect stuff going on in prosecution and so on. So we shall see. There's still an uncertainty whether the current president wants to have Ukraine under the rule of law, or it will be disaster as usual.
So, sounds optimistic. So you would wait for concrete steps and for these reforms to be completely implemented before having a proper forecast over Ukraine's economy here.
I would say before I'm getting too optimistic, yes, I want to see the concrete steps. And I think that international investors will want to see this as well. Because, for example, after the events on ArcelorMittal Steel, I think you're familiar with it, everyone will just
well, then when
took the
there was
position,
raids
we'll wait
on
and
Muscle,
see. We'll wait and see.
Now let's focus a little bit on the IMF and on the relations between the government and the IMF. Now the IMF review mission is now in Kyiv, and they expressed their intention to continue, quote, a constructive dialogue on a new cooperation program. What other signals should Ukraine expect from them? What kind of attitude does it show?
First, they wanted to achieve a staff-level agreement. So the mission has to talk to Ministry of Finance, to the National Bank, and so on, and to get the targets and milestones for the reforms, for the budget deficit, and then propose some program. The talks are that the program will be 3 to 4 years long, and the size could probably be $4 to $5 billion, but it's still very questionable. The most expected milestones will be the budget deficit, of course, but it is more or less in the framework. It will be land reform, privatization likely, and there is a progress in these spheres. But the game changer and the real disaster might be the Privatbank story, which unfolds right now. With Valeria Gontareva and
we talked about it earlier.
Exactly, and all the courts. So here, I think it will play a much bigger role than even before. So
Privatbank, the whole story between Privatbank, so namely the kind of struggle of power around Privatbank by Mr. Kolomoisky and by the National Bank, would constitute for you, is under scrutiny right now from international. That's what you're saying, basically.
Yeah, and that's what the Prime Minister says. He says that all the outcomes of negotiations should be checked with the IMF, and even the IMF probably will be participating in these negotiations or something like that. So we can hope, at least we can hope, for some more or less positive resolution of this case. I mean, positive not for any of the participants, but for Ukrainian people.
Now, the path that Mr. Zelensky took and publicly took of liberalization, privatization of the country, how does it comply with the IMF requirements? How does it?
It's completely in line with all the advice which IMF previously gave to Ukraine, and we can actually expect more or less the same milestones in this program as we had in our previous programs. Moreover, the National Bank team and the Ministry of Finance team, they're still the same, and these are two most important institutions, so they inherited all their stuff and all their policies, so probably there would be nothing much changed.
So this continuity is kind of a guarantee that there's going to be some sort of stability here?
There's no guarantees. There's never guarantee, but at least it is some guideline.
So we talked a little bit about the IMF and liberalization, and concerning a certain declaration by Prime Minister Alexei Goncharuk, he said that the main task of the government for the next 5 years is to increase the country's economy by at least 40%.
3%, yeah.
How realistic is this plan, really?
For me, I used to work with the fixed income instruments where the risk is the top thing which you look on. So for me, it would be much more important if the economy and economic growth would be sustainable, if the economy would be stable. If, okay, I don't need 7% growth, but I definitely don't want the GDP to contract by 1%, by 15% or else. Ukraine is developing slower than its neighbors because of its growth and sustainability. So we already seen the 5 to 7% growth back in early 2000s. When the economy was booming and the credit market was formed a big bubble, and then we saw the deep and very, very deep economic crisis. So personally, I don't want fast economic growth. I want sustainable economic growth, and that's important.
Which brings me to my next and last question of this interview. Would you say that this liberalization program, privatization program, this path toward neoliberalization, and following some sort of path like Mr. Macron or that kind of model, would you say that Ukraine is ready and Ukrainian market is ready for that kind of policy?
It will definitely demand the very close cooperation of many different institutions. And we see new people in almost each institution. So that's a story of how will they learn to work together.
Well, thank you very much for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio to talk about the draft budget and Ukraine's economic policy.
Thank you.
That was Mariya Repko, Deputy Executive Director at the Center for Economic Strategy. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.